Hello and welcome to Fireside Chats with me, Dr. Peters. I was born and raised in New Hampshire and I completed my PhD at the University of Glasgow. My research focuses on the intellectual history of the US Constitution, and how that history, philosophy, political theory, and constitutional law can help us better understand and address contemporary social and political issues. Now, today what I'd like to chat about is education, and specifically its relationship to democracy. Now, what raises this topic is it's graduation season. But more importantly, the fact that we're not talking about education, at least not as a nation. It's become a state and local issue. During the current president's first term, we talked about education all the time, and particularly the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, and her efforts to essentially gut and destroy that federal department and agency, returning decisions effectively back to the states, as well as cutting a lot of the funding that was coming from the federal government to schools in those states, and particularly those schools in areas most in need of help. So today, there are only a few people talking about it, like the senatorial candidate in Texas, James Tellerico, who is discussing it, but he's mainly discussing it as a state issue. And that means we're no longer discussing it as a national issue. It's not in the national news, and so not a lot of people are seeing it, even if there are issues in their own state with the education system. And in many states, there are, because these state governments have put people like Betsy DeVos into power. And we've seen similar policies of defunding schools, cutting programs, and essentially trying to erode and dismantle our public education system without most people even being aware that it's happening in their state, especially if they don't have children. Now, as always, to better understand and address and respond to this issue, we're going to look at the founders and their ideas about public education, as well as some history, theory, and philosophy to figure out why it's important and why some people would try to go to such lengths to get rid of public education. When it came to education, pretty much all the founders were huge fans. They saw themselves as sons of the Enlightenment and leaders of a free and enlightened people, as they often said. And some of those ideals of the Enlightenment were challenging assumptions, authorities, and traditions with reason and logic. And this is what you learn to do, this critical thinking, through a liberal arts degree that began to come about during the Enlightenment and the tradition in which many of the founders were educated. However, they did have a big fight over establishing an American university. However, the fight wasn't about whether we should have one or not, but moreover, what state it would be in. All of the delegates at the convention wanted the honor and privilege of having the new American university in their state. So it wasn't, should we have public education or not? It was, we want it, and we want to be the ones that have the university and have that honor and privilege and that great benefit for our constituents in our states. Sounds a little bit different than some of the rhetoric we've heard over the past few decades about public education. Now, many of their ideas about education came out of the Scottish Enlightenment. The founders looked to Scotland as a model and an example for how education could help you rapidly develop your country. In the 17th century, the Scots started a policy of trying to establish a school in every parish, essentially public education. Now, it was just for boys, but in the 17th century, that was a huge leap forward, and the results seemed to speak for themselves. And so, given this affinity for Scotland, many of the American universities at the time would hire Scotsmen to be part of their faculty. For instance, we get John Witherspoon, who would be president of Princeton and also go on to sign the Declaration of Independence. Also, many of the founders went to study at Scottish universities and or sent their kids to study there. For instance, we get Benjamin Rush, who studies medicine at the University of Edinburgh, and then also comes back and signs the Declaration of Independence. Well, Thomas Jefferson, the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, describes the University of Edinburgh as one of the two eyes of the Enlightenment that was happening all over Europe at the time, and describes Edinburgh itself as the Athens of the North. Scotland becomes this intellectual powerhouse, punching way above its weight for such a tiny and, at the times, economically backward country. And the Americans said, hey, if they can do it, we can do it. And they could see the results of this public education initiative in the person of James Wilson. That should be no surprise that I threw James Wilson into this as well. However, He was the son of a tenant farmer in Fife and went to the local parish school. He did so well at the school, he won a bursary or scholarship to go study at the University of St. Andrews, and then goes on to take classes at the University of Glasgow, where he might have run into some of the leading lights of the Scottish Enlightenment at the time, such as Thomas Reid or Adam Smith. Now, when Wilson arrives in the then British colonies, he pretty quickly gets a job as a tutor at the College of Pennsylvania. And if you've watched videos from before, he also goes on to sign the Declaration of Independence, helps write the US Constitution, and is one of our first Supreme Court justices. And it's interesting to note, at the Constitutional Convention, Wilson was largely regarded as the smartest guy in the room and was through most of his political career. They saw this as what the Scottish educational system produced, and it did so in part because it started with kids. We had a public education system in Scotland all the way back then in the 18th century that allowed a farmer's son to become one of the leading politicians and lawyers in the newly formed United States. Now, many of the founders and many modern political theorists and scientists recognize the importance of education for a thriving democracy. We have the classic mantra that comes from a paraphrase of Jefferson's words: a well-informed citizenry is a prerequisite for democracy. And to be well-informed, you have to be educated in such a way as to understand and be able to critically engage with that information. Political theorists and scientists have again and again studied and looked at the link between things like education and literacy and a thriving democracy. Education, and particularly for the founders, a liberal arts education, was necessary for a democracy or liberty. Such an education provided citizens with the skills necessary to take up those duties and responsibilities of advanced citizenship. And primarily, at least in my opinion, what these skills are things like critical thinking, critical analysis, and being able to see an idea and situation from multiple perspectives, to be able to debate it, engage with it, and understand it on a deeper level, and understand where other people are coming from. Again, this is what a liberal arts education tries to produce. Now, interestingly, Wilson also saw another dimension to this relationship between education and democracy. He saw democracy as acting as a kind of practical education for citizens. Since we had the right to vote and or were required to sit on juries, we would have to educate ourselves on the things that we were voting on. And we would get to see how well those laws and their application were working, particularly as jurors. We could see, whoa, this law and the way it's being applied right now seems radically unjust. We need to do something about it. And similarly, as voters, we would say, hey, we need to create this fund to help this other group of people that's dealing with a natural disaster. We have that all the time now in the United States, and it's why we created FEMA. And the hope for Wilson was that in doing this and educating ourselves on the struggles and successes of other communities, sometimes thousands of miles away, we would start to see those other communities not just as other communities, but part of our broader national community. And in this sense, we would expand our conception of who is part of our community, who we care about, with the idea, at least according to Wilson, that American citizens would become citizens of the world. We would learn to see the entire species, all of humanity, as part of our collective global community. But for Wilson, education and democracy are also reciprocal and synergistic on another level. In his lectures on law, Wilson writes that, and I quote, "Where liberty prevails, the arts and sciences lift up their heads and flourish. Where the arts and sciences flourish, political and moral improvements will likewise be made. All will receive from each, and each will receive from all. Mutual support and assistance. Mutually supported and assisted, all may be carried to a degree of perfection hitherto unknown, perhaps hitherto not believed." Essentially, what Wilson is saying in this quote is that democracy, liberty, that right to have a say in how we govern ourselves, and liberty on an even broader sense, creates the space in which education can happen and knowledge can be developed. the arts and sciences can flourish, i.e., the liberal arts. And similarly, where the development of knowledge is free to flourish, we see improvements in politics and society and governance. That this is a reciprocal synergistic relationship. And if you've watched this channel before, this might sound a lot like Wilson's model of democracy, and that's because it's part of it. The engine or driving force in Wilson's model of democracy is the development of knowledge, which comes through education. In Wilson's model, knowledge is a product of society, and government is meant to protect and improve society, while also being able to be improved by the knowledge developed by society. So improvements in society lead to improvements in knowledge, which through democracy, people can use to improve their government, which can then better improve society once again. So we have this synergistic reciprocal relationship that Wilson believes might produce unprecedented progress and flourishing for the human species as a whole. Sounds like a great idea. Sounds a little bit like Star Trek. And within that model, public education seems like the clearest way in which government can fulfill its primary duty of protecting and improving society by giving them the skills and tools to uphold the duties and responsibilities of advanced citizenship that democracy, that liberty require. And so directly nurture this reciprocal synergistic relationship and allow it to flourish with improvements in governance and improvements in society, and overall working towards the common good and making it better for everyone. Public education seems like the clear and reasonable choice. So why do some people oppose it and try to erode it by defunding and demonizing it? Well, this campaign to get rid of the Department of Education and undermine public education generally did not begin with the current administration or even Betsy DeVos in the current president's first term. The current iteration of this campaign against public education really started in earnest with the Reagan administration, which again, regular viewers shouldn't be terribly surprised by. Reagan was the first to directly attack the Department of Education and threaten to get rid of it, although he wasn't able to follow through on it. However, he did manage to deregulate higher education, essentially transforming it from a common good into a business model. And what that's produced over the intervening decades is skyrocketing tuition prices and arguably a decrease in the quality of the education. That money isn't going to professors or to innovate how we teach the future citizens and leaders of the world. It's going to administrators, essentially the CEOs of universities now, and building projects, at least at the major institutions. And for more than a decade, I've watched as Republican candidates have stumbled over themselves trying to say they'll get rid of the Department of Education first. This became a mainstream issue. And we've seen in our culture the demonization of public school teachers as the ones we blame for all the ills of our society and all the problems that our children have. They're accused of brainwashing our children with leftist ideas, or at least that's what they were accused of when I was younger, and especially higher education is still seen as brainwashing young people with these crazy radical ideas. However, today it's turned into attacks on the LGBTQ community. How dare us teach children to accept and respect differences, which is the foundation of a classically liberal society, that people are free to be who they are and not be discriminated against based on how they were born, whether it be the color of their skin or their sexual orientation. In a liberal society, that's not supposed to make a difference. And especially today, the accusations of manipulation and brainwashing seem quite a bit like projection coming from the current administration and this political movement generally. And to get back to the question of why would somebody attack education and public education specifically, we can look at the current president's famous quote, where he said, to paraphrase, "I love the uneducated. I love uneducated voters." And while he never explicitly says why, many of us looked at that and said, Well, of course you do, because they're easier to trick and manipulate, which is kind of the foundation of that entire political movement and his political power is tricking and manipulating people. And now it's important to remember here when I say uneducated or referred to his quotation of uneducated, I'm not talking about diplomas and degrees necessarily, although they tend to be a good indicator of people that have certain skills that come with education. However, I have seen people with very advanced degrees that don't necessarily possess that skill. And I also know farmers who are far wiser than I am. So it's not necessarily a question of formal education, although education ideally should be providing people with those skills. Again, those would be those critical thinking skills that we discussed earlier. And it's those critical thinking skills that allow us to see through attempted manipulations, tricks, and brainwashing. We're trained to think critically, to think independently, to think for ourselves. This is the ideal of the Enlightenment and a liberal arts education. And so, anyone who is attacking an education that provides the skills that allow us to take up the duties and responsibilities of advanced citizenship and see attempted manipulation and tricks for what they are, to not be brainwashed, is likely trying to manipulate and brainwash you. They don't want citizens that vote. They want subjects and slaves. They want to be a king. And we can see this throughout history where education is banned from certain groups. Slaves were not allowed to learn how to read in the South in many of the states. There were laws about this because there was a fear that if slaves became educated and read the same philosophy and political theory that the American colonists had, they too might foment a revolution and demand their inalienable right of liberty. Similarly, women weren't allowed to go to universities until the mid 19th century and weren't allowed into elite schools in the Ivy League until the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Again, denying education was a means to keep a subjected and oppressed people group subjected and oppressed. So if somebody's trying to take away your education, they're trying to subjugate and oppress you. Education and the ability to think critically is a powerful tool and an existential threat to authoritarians and wannabe kings. So how can we respond to these attacks on educations and particularly our public education system that prepares our children, the next generation, to be able to support a thriving democracy and not get brainwashed and manipulated? Well, first and foremost, we can take up that duty and responsibility by educating ourselves. That's part of the advanced citizenship that democracy and liberty requires. We have to make ourselves a well-informed citizenry. And we can vote for people who see the value in education, who want to fully fund it and support it. And on a deeper level, we can start to push back against this culture that demonizes and demeans public education and our public school teachers. Our teachers get paid next to nothing. They are not doing this for the opportunity to brainwash your children. They're doing it because they love the kids, they love the community, and they love their country. They recognize that this is a civic duty. But most fundamentally, most teachers, myself included, do it because we love to see the light bulb go off. We love to see that moment when a student finally grasps a complex or difficult problem. Or even more so, when they start to really analyze and critique information, to start to really think originally. My job as a university professor was never to teach students what to think. It was to teach them how to think. I am not so arrogant as to think that I know everything and I should form little clones of myself. Not only is that a level of hubris more dangerous than anything we've ever known, but it's boring. I love the fact that my students challenge me regularly, and every teacher I've met who's good at their job does as well. And we have tons of wonderful public school teachers that need our support, not only through voting and all of that, but culturally. We can defend them when we hear other people putting them down or attacking them at school board meetings or in other situations when they're blamed for what's gone wrong in society or with kids today. We can stand up for them, and we can stand up for education and take pride in knowing things, not as a way to belittle or demean others, but as a way of saying we're trying to do our duty to be better citizens, to take up the mantle of advanced citizenship that our founders left us and democracy and liberty require of us. So, with that, it leaves us a choice of what we want America and Americanness to stand for and look like. Do we want to be a country and a people that values education, liberty, and democracy? Or are we really okay with letting ourselves be manipulated and tricked and subjugating ourselves to a tyrannical authoritarian? And again, that's stark. But from my perspective, at the base level of principle, that's what we're choosing between. That's what we'll be choosing between in November at the polls, and also what we choose between every day and how we conduct our lives. Do we try to continue to educate ourselves and respect, value, and defend those who try to help other people educate themselves, our public school teachers and university professors? Or do we continue to use them as a scapegoat for all the ills of society? And so leave us with an uneducated society that does not have the critical thinking skills necessary to see through the manipulation, brainwashing, and trickery of an authoritarian and wannabe king. A situation that will lead to our subjugation under a tyrannical rule. That's our choice. And for now, I'll leave you to ponder what you'll decide. As always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found it interesting and educational and maybe even inspirational. If you're interested in more content like this, I put out new videos every Friday, so please do subscribe. And all the videos are accompanied by an essay that goes into a little bit more detail and is a little bit more structured. And as always, feel free to ask questions, comment, and like. Those really help with my numbers and help get this information out to more people. But more importantly, I find them really encouraging, and it helps me not feel like I'm just speaking to the void. So thank you so much to all of you who subscribe and regularly comment and ask questions. I really appreciate it, and it keeps me going. And with that, thanks again for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.